Only 7 minutes before takeoff, Jasmine Crockett was ripped from her VIP seat in front of 42 stunned passengers. Her dignity hit the floor as an officer's smirk turned an ordinary gate into a battlefield of power and humiliation. Phones rose, hearts pounded, and the crowd erupted in disbelief. But here's the question was Jasmine just another passenger or the spark that exposed something far bigger? That humiliation did not end at the gate. It followed her like a shadow clinging to her skin, replaying with every blink. Hours later, the subway platform shuddered like a living beast, iron bones grinding as a train screamed somewhere deep in the tunnel. The officer's smirk, the bystander's silence still burned in Jasmine's chest, pressing like a bruise that refused to fade. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp bursts of white across a sea of restless commuters. In the middle of it all stood Jasmine, motionless against the chaos, her black coat clinging to her frame, as if the air itself were holding its breath. In one hand, a folded letter trembled between her fingers, alive with words she could never unsee. In the other, her suitcase handle glinted, clenched so hard her knuckles whitened, as though letting go would mean surrender. The crowd surged around her, each face a reflection of the unrest boiling across America. A mother hissed about rent she couldn't pay. A man spat the word criminals under his breath. Two teenagers whispered about another protest turned violent the night before. Every fragment of conversation sliced into Jasmine's chest like glass, because she knew each one was part of the storm she had been walking into for months. Fear coiled in her ribs, a tight knot, whispering she was next, that the system she had spent her life challenging would soon come to collect its price. Yet the letter in her hand burned hotter than fear. Her friend's handwriting had scrawled across the page, "Don't stop now, even if it costs you." Each syllable was a brand seared into her bones, daring her to move forward when the world begged her to stay silent. The screech of brakes tore through the platform, a metallic scream that made heads turn and hearts quicken. Jasmine stepped forward. Her heels struck the concrete with sharp clicks that cut above the noise, every step an announcement, every echo a countdown. She was no longer just another passenger, she was a spark moving toward tinder. The folded letter crumpled slightly in her palm, its edges biting into her skin, anchoring her in the storm of doubt clawing at her mind. A man in a faded uniform brushed past her, muttering, "Troublemakers never learn." The words were meant to vanish into the noise, but for Jasmine they detonated like a curse, another hand trying to shove her back into silence. Then came the roar. The tunnel spat out a wall of heat and wind as the incoming train burst into view, its headlights slashing across the crowd like searchlights. Papers flew, scarves whipped, a child cried out, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, eyes locked on the approaching blaze of steel, and in that moment her body carried both fragility and defiance. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman ready to shatter or to strike. Her breath steadied, her grip on the letter tightened, and with the screech of the train clawing at her ears, Jasmine stepped closer to the edge, her silhouette carved against the oncoming storm. The city held its breath with her. The roar of the train still echoed in Jasmine's chest hours later as she stood before a crowded community hall, fluorescent lights buzzing above like restless insects. Folding chairs scraped the linoleum floor, voices murmured low, and the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. But all of it faded the moment Jasmine placed her palms against the wooden podium. The letter from earlier was tucked deep into her coat pocket, but its fire hadn't dimmed. It pulsed through her veins, pushing every word to the surface. She inhaled, steadying herself, though her hands trembled, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the murmurs like a siren. "They don't stop us because we broke the law." Jasmine said, each syllable clipped her throat tight with rage she struggled to cage. "They stop us because of who we are, because of the faces we carry into the daylight." A hush rippled across the crowd, and even those who had been leaning against the back wall straightened as though pulled by invisible strings. Jasmine's chest rose heavy and unsteady, but she didn't falter. Her eyes locked on the front row where a young mother clutched her child's wrist with protective desperation, as if afraid the world might snatch him away the moment she blinked. Jasmine's pulse quickened, the same fear burning in her blood, and her voice quivered between fury and grief. She spoke of the traffic stops, of IDs checked twice, of men dragged from cars for the crime of existing in the wrong skin. Every word was a match struck against the room's silence, and the audience leaned forward as though afraid to miss a single spark. Jasmine's voice wavered once, catching on the memory of being shoved into the back of a police car at 16, the sticky vinyl clinging to her legs as she prayed someone would believe her story. The pain in her chest sharpened, but she didn't swallow it down. She released it, letting the quiver in her tone bleed into the air. Vulnerability filled the room like smoke, and instead of weakening her, it bound every listener tighter to her words. An elderly man in the third row lifted a trembling hand to his face, wiping tears he hadn't meant to shed. His eyes met Jasmine's for a split second, wet and shining, and he gave the smallest nod, a gesture heavy as an oath. Jasmine's throat tightened, but she pressed on her voice louder now, riding the wave of his grief and her own. The crowd shifted, murmurs of agreement, rising like a drumbeat beneath her sentences, a rhythm of shared pain that was beginning to transform into something else, hope. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone, her palms flat on the wood, her eyes blazing with a force that silenced even the coughs and shifting chairs. "This is not survival," she said, each word punched into the air with a sharpness that made spines stiffen. "This is war disguised as policy, and every day we don't fight back, we surrender another piece of ourselves." The hall erupted, not with chaos, but with the thunder of applause, stomping feet, snapping fingers that cracked like gunfire. Jasmine's heart pounded with it, her body trembling under the weight of so many voices colliding with hers. In that storm of sound, she felt the shift, the moment when grief became fuel, when silence turned into fire. And though her breath came heavy, her stance never wavered, because she knew the room no longer carried her weight, it carried its own. The applause still rang in Jasmine's ears long after the meeting had ended, echoing in her chest like aftershocks from an earthquake. The hall was empty now, chairs stacked in lopsided towers, the faint scent of sweat and burnt coffee clinging to the air. Jasmine lingered by the doorframe, her fingertips grazing the wooden edge, her body trembling, not from fear but from the surge of energy that had carried her through. For a moment she allowed herself to breathe, to let the silence feel like victory. When she reached her apartment later that night, the hallway was still lined with peeling paint and buzzing fluorescent lights that stuttered like weak pulses. She slid her key into the lock, her body aching with exhaustion, but the moment the door swung open, something caught her eye. An envelope, unmarked, pale, almost glowing in the dim light, lay on the floor just inside. Jasmine froze, her breath caught halfway between inhale and scream. The edges of the paper quivered slightly from the draft, as though the note itself were alive, waiting. She bent slowly, every muscle stiff, and picked it up. The handwriting scrawled across the front was jagged, rushed as if carved with anger rather than ink. Her stomach turned even before she unfolded it, but when she did, the words slammed into her chest with a violence that stole the air from her lungs. "Stop stirring trouble before we stop you." Her hands tightened on the page, the paper crackling under her grip, her pulse hammering in her ears like a warning siren. The applause from earlier was gone now, replaced by the hollow thud of her heart and the sudden weight of silence pressing in on her walls. Jasmine's eyes darted around the apartment, every shadow now a threat, every creak in the wood a footstep. The air seemed colder, sharper, as though the very room had turned against her. She dropped the letter on the counter, but it didn't sit still. It stared back an accusation, a verdict. Fear surged up her throat, hot and choking. But beneath it, something else stirred, anger, sharp and unyielding. She stepped to the window and pulled the curtain aside, scanning the street below. Cars idled under broken streetlights, figures moved in the distance, their shapes blurred and ominous. Was someone still watching? Her reflection in the glass was pale eyes, wide and blazing. But behind the terror, there was fire. She pressed her palm against the window, grounding herself, remembering the old man's tearful nod, the mother clutching her child, the thunder of voices that had risen with hers. The people she spoke for had no choice but to live with fear every day. How could she retreat now, even as it crept under her own skin? Still, the question clawed at her. How much danger was too much? The letter lay there, stark against the counter, its message louder than the silence it had been delivered in. Jasmine picked it up again, her fingers trembling, less this time, her jaw tightening as if daring the words to break her. The crowd had carried her earlier, but here in the solitude of her apartment, it was only her breath, her fear her choice. The air pressed closer, heavier, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. Her chest rose once, slow and deliberate, and in the low hum of the fluorescent light, Jasmine whispered into the emptiness. What will I do when hope meets real danger? The walls didn't answer, but her voice lingered sharp as glass, alive as a wound. Is Jasmine too visible now, or just becoming powerful enough to matter? The letter still lay on the counter like a stain that wouldn't fade. But by morning, it was no longer the only weight pressing down on Jasmine. Her phone buzzed with endless alerts, the screen alive with headlines that painted her name in venom. Radical Congresswoman sparks, unrest Crockett fans. The flames, is she dangerous or just desperate? The glow from the screen lit her face in the dim apartment, every word carving another cut into her chest. She scrolled faster, heart hammering, as though speed could blunt the blows, but each headline struck harder than the last. The television echoed the same chorus anchors, with polished smiles spitting her name like a curse. Clips of her speech from the community hall flashed across the screen, but the edits were jagged, spliced to make her look like a threat instead of a voice for the voiceless. Jasmine's throat tightened, her stomach twisting, as she listened to strangers debating her existence as though she were a storm to be contained, not a human being. Her reflection in the black edge of the TV looked pale, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, and for one trembling moment she wondered if they were right, if she had become exactly what they accused her of being. She turned the volume down, the silence ringing louder than the noise, and pressed her palms against the cool surface of the table. The anonymous threat from last night and the media firestorm this morning bled together until they were indistinguishable, two sides of the same blade, aimed squarely at her chest. Anxiety crawled under her skin, sharp and relentless, whispering that she was cornered, that the machine had already closed its jaws around her. She thought of her family, of her mother's trembling hands on the phone, begging her to keep safe, and the fear pressed harder, nearly choking. But as her breath quickened, something steadier rose to the surface. She saw again the old man nodding through tears, the mother clinging to her child, the thunder of a community refusing to stay silent. That memory cut through the noise like a beam of light through smoke. Jasmine's shoulders straightened, her hands curled into fists on the table, and the fear that had been gnawing at her ribs hardened into something sharper, defiance. They could smear her name across every headline, but they couldn't erase the truth of what she had seen, what she had lived. She opened her laptop, the keys clattering like gunfire, as she pulled up article after article, dissecting the lies word by word. Each smear only fueled her, each accusation, sparking a counter-argument that formed in her mind like steel. Her jaw clenched and she whispered to the empty room as if speaking directly to the anchors, the politicians, the faceless voices circling her. If you want me quiet, you'll have to break me in half. And even then, my silence will scream louder than your lies. The words came out low, steady, but they vibrated through her chest like a drumbeat. Her pulse slowed, her breathing steadied, and for the first time since the note slid under her door, Jasmine felt the storm inside her shift. Anxiety still throbbed, coiled in her body, but it no longer owned her. It was fuel now, gasoline poured across the fire in her chest. The media could brand her a radical, a threat, even an enemy, but she knew what she really was. And as the morning light cut through her blinds, slicing the room into sharp bands of golden shadow, Jasmine made herself a silent promise she would not step back. The days that followed bled together in whispers, the kind that carried more weight than shouts. In her neighborhood grocery store, Jasmine felt the shift in the air before she heard it. Two women by the fruit stand, voices hushed, one shaking her head, the other saying, "She's bringing trouble here." A man outside the corner cafe narrowed his eyes as she passed, muttering, low enough to sting, but not enough to confront. The sting of betrayal pressed into her skin. Once familiar streets now felt hostile, like every crack in the pavement was watching her. Yet amid the suspicion, there were nods too small, trembling gestures from strangers who looked at her not with fear, but with desperate hope, as though she carried something they couldn't afford to lose. It was one of those silent supporters who finally broke the quiet. A young organizer, sleeves rolled up and voice shaking with urgency, came to Jasmine's door late one night. "We can't let them own the narrative," he said, breathless, his fist balled, as if ready to fight the entire system alone. "We need to stand together. We're planning a protest tomorrow, and we need you there." Jasmine's chest tightened, the threat of the anonymous note flashing in her mind, the smear campaigns still circling like vultures. But the memory of the old man's tears, the mother clinging to her child, pressed harder. She nodded once, slow but steady, sealing herself into the storm. The protest began under a sky the color of steel clouds, pressing low, as if mirroring the weight of the day. Hundreds gathered, their faces raw with grief and fire, their signs raised high in trembling hands. Jasmine stood at the center, the microphone shaking in her grasp, her heartbeat pounding louder than the chants surrounding her. Fear gnawed at her ribs, threatening to steal her breath. But when she looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, strangers, children hoisted onto shoulders, something broke open inside her. The quiver in her voice became strength as she spoke. They want us to believe we are less, that our worth depends on the names they call us, the cages they place us, in the silence they demand from us. Her voice cracked, but she didn't pull back. The vulnerability made every word strike harder. But hear me now, you are human. I am human. And no law, no badge, no headline can strip that truth from us. A silence fell so heavy, it seemed to push the air flat, and then, like a tide crashing, the crowd erupted. Some clapped, others wept openly, voices overlapping in a chorus that trembled with grief and hope. Jasmine's eyes blurred with tears. She could no longer hold back, hot rivers cutting down her cheeks, her chest aching with the rawness of it all. She saw the young organizer crying too, head bowed, his shoulders shaking as he whispered, "Finally, someone said it." The moment was fragile yet unbreakable, a shared wound laid bare beneath the gray sky. The protest wasn't just noise. It was solidarity etched into the air, grief transformed into defiance. And as Jasmine stood there trembling with exhaustion and fire, she realized this was bigger than her name, bigger than the whispers, bigger even than the threats waiting in the shadows. For the first time since the storm began, Jasmine felt the crowd carry her, lifting her higher than fear, binding her to them with invisible threads of hope and sorrow. In their eyes, she saw not just belief, but survival. The chants of the protest still thundered in Jasmine's veins as she walked back through the dim corridors of her office building, her blazer damp from the drizzle, her throat raw from hours of shouting. The night felt heavy but alive, the kind of weight that carried meaning, and for a fleeting moment, she thought the worst had passed. But when she reached the reception desk, the look on the secretary's face made her stop cold. The woman's eyes darted away, lips pressed tight, hands shuffling papers as if burying a secret she didn't want to speak aloud. Jasmine's stomach sank, the silence sharper than any accusation. Her friend Daniel, the one who had stood at the protest with her sign raised high, was gone. His desk, once cluttered with half-empty coffee cups and crumpled notes, with stripped bare drawers, emptied chair pushed neatly under the table, as though he had never existed there at all. Jasmine's breath caught a flash of disbelief, fighting against the truth that screamed in front of her. She grabbed a colleague by the arm, eyes blazing, and demanded to know what happened. The woman flinched, voice barely above a whisper. "They fired him. Said his presence was disruptive." The word slammed into Jasmine like a fist. Disruptive. As if standing by her side, as if daring to believe in dignity was a crime worthy of erasure. Her pulse roared in her ears, louder than the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above. She could see Daniel's face in her mind, the way his eyes had glistened during her speech, the relief in his trembling smile when she shouted, "You are human. I am human." Now he had paid the price for daring to stand too close. She stormed into the manager's office without knocking, her voice sharp enough to slice through the stale air. "Where is he?" she demanded, her fist clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. The manager looked up slowly, his expression cold, rehearsed, a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "Mr. Carter has been relieved of his position," he said flatly, fingers drumming on the desk. "We cannot tolerate employees who bring unnecessary attention to this workplace." Jasmine's chest heaved, fury and disbelief colliding until her vision blurred. "Unnecessary attention," she spat. "You mean courage. You mean loyalty. You mean standing for something bigger than a paycheck." The manager's lips curved in the faintest smirk, the kind that came from someone who thought power was permanent. "Congresswoman, I suggest you focus on your own role before others lose theirs." The threat was casual, like a knife hidden in velvet, but Jasmine felt it slice straight through her. For a moment, the office seemed to shrink, the walls closing in the very air, pressing against her lungs. She slammed her palms against the desk, the sound cracking through the room like gunfire. "You will not scare me into silence," she hissed, her voice trembling, but unbroken. "Not now. Not ever." But when she stepped back into the empty corridor, the anger burned differently. It wasn't just fury, it was a realization, cold and sharp, that the network of fear was tightening. First the note under her door, then the headlines branding her dangerous, now her friend erased from his livelihood. It was a chain, deliberate and suffocating, meant to choke not only her voice, but anyone brave enough to echo it. The weight of that truth pressed hard on her chest, heavier than the drizzle that still clung to her clothes. She paused by the darkened window, her reflection fractured in the glass, her eyes blazing with a question that tore at her ribs. How far was she willing to go? How much was she willing to risk, not just for herself, but for everyone who could no longer afford to stand? The silence outside stretched wide, the city lights flickering like warning signals against the black sky. Jasmine pressed her hand flat against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface, her pulse hammering with the certainty that a choice was closing in on her. How far is Jasmine willing to risk to stand for others? When the lines are drawn, which side will Jasmine choose? The apartment was silent, but it throbbed like a wound. Jasmine dropped her keys on the counter. The metallic clatter cracked through the stillness like a gunshot. She pulled off her blazer, its fabric heavy with rain and sweat, and sank onto the worn sofa. For the first time all day, there were no chants, no cameras, no eyes waiting for her to rise. Only silence, and the silence felt hostile. On the coffee table lay an envelope. Its corners softened her mother's neat script, etched across the front. Jasmine stared at it for a long moment, her pulse tightening, before she reached out with trembling fingers. The paper felt heavier than any threat she'd faced on the streets. She unfolded it slowly. "My child, please stay safe. I know the fire in you. I've seen it since you were young. But I also know the world you're fighting. Your father's illness grows worse. I need you here, not in the headlines, not in danger." Her breath stuttered. The words blurred as tears welled, spilling hot across her cheeks. She pressed the letter to her chest as if holding it close could erase the guilt carving through her ribs. In an instant, she was back in the small kitchen of her childhood, her father's cough rattling in the next room, her mother's hands raw from holding everything together. The weight of family pulled at her with brutal force. Her body shook. Was she selfish, out there shouting into microphones while her parents sat at home, fearing her name would appear in an obituary? Every choice she made for the movement felt like a betrayal of the people who had given her life. But another voice rose louder, cutting through the guilt like steel. She saw the old man nodding through tears at her speech. She saw the mother clutching her child in the front row. She heard the chants, the voices that had lifted hers into something larger than she could ever be alone. They didn't get to walk away. They lived the fight every day with no microphones, no cameras, no platform. Survival itself was protest. Jasmine pushed up from the sofa, pacing the narrow stretch of floor, the letter shaking in her fist. One moment guilt slammed her chest. The next defiance surged hot and unrelenting. She stopped by the window, staring out at the indifferent city lights. Her reflection in the glass was fractured eyes, swollen cheeks streaked with tears, but burning still. The letter trembled in her hand, both a wound and a weapon. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, whispering into the night, "Am I a daughter first, or a fighter?" Her voice cracked, but the question didn't vanish. It hung in the room like smoke, suffocating alive. And as her reflection stared back at her, split between grief and fire, Jasmine knew there was no easy answer, only the choice that would tear her in half. The letter from her mother still lay unfolded on the kitchen counter when Jasmine stepped outside the next morning, her body heavy with sleeplessness. The air was damp, thick with the metallic scent of rain, and every sound on the street seemed too sharp. The rumble of engines, the slam of car doors, the buzz of neon signs fighting daylight. She tightened her coat around her shoulders, clutching her bag like a shield. But the moment she turned the corner, the trap was already waiting. A reporter lunged from the sidewalk, microphone raised like a weapon, cameras flashing in staccato bursts that made the world flicker as though under siege. There she is, the woman of the moment. He barked, his grin sharp enough to draw blood. Congresswoman Crockett, how does it feel to be the face of unrest? The radical who lights fires and then walks away before the smoke clears. The words struck fast, jagged, designed not to ask but to accuse, and the crowd of onlookers thickened instantly. Phones rose, faces leaned in their eyes, hungry for spectacle. Jasmine froze for half a heartbeat, her pulse slamming against her ribs, her throat suddenly dry, and for the briefest flash, she thought of retreating, of disappearing back into the safety of her apartment. But she didn't move. She forced her breath steady, lifted her chin, and met the reporter's stare with the kind of stillness that could silence a room. "You call me the woman of the moment," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the noise like glass under pressure. "But the truth is bigger than me. It belongs to every person who's been stopped, silenced, or erased for daring to exist." The words came steady, but inside her chest, her heart hammered so loud it drowned the city each beat, reminding her how thin the line was between defiance and collapse. The reporter leaned closer, microphone nearly touching her lips, his eyes glittering with the thrill of cornering prey. "So you admit it then? You're leading this wave of chaos. Do you realize people have lost jobs because of you? Do you even care who pays the price for your crusade?" His voice was sharp, mocking, calculated to tear the ground from beneath her feet. Jasmine felt her stomach twist, guilt clawing against her ribs, Daniel's empty desk, burning fresh in her memory. For a flicker, fear shot across her face, raw and unguarded, and the camera caught it frozen, undeniable. But just as quickly, resolve surged. She steadied her eyes locked directly onto the nearest lens and let the silence hang heavy until the noise around her dulled. "I care," she said finally, voice low but caring, "because I have seen their tears and I have carried their grief. If speaking that truth makes me dangerous, then maybe the danger isn't me. It's the system that forced us here." The crowd stirred, whispers rising, some hostile, others reverent, the tension vibrating like a live wire. The reporter faltered for a second, lips parting, the script in his hands, slipping under the weight of her defiance. Jasmine's pulse still raced, her hands clammy at her sides, but she didn't let it show. She held the gaze of the camera until the red light blinked like a warning, until her reflection inside that tiny glass eye showed both the fear she couldn't escape and the resolve she refused to abandon. Vulnerability and fire braided together, fragile and unbreakable all at once. And in that moment, the city saw her not as prey, not as spectacle, but as something far more dangerous, human. The echoes of the reporter's ambush still clung to Jasmine when she stepped into her apartment that night. She shut the door, leaned back against it, and exhaled. For a moment, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint drip of the faucet were almost enough to trick her body into calm. But then her phone buzzed on the counter, one vibration, sharp and insistent, like a warning. Jasmine picked it up without thinking. No sender, no words, only a video file. Her thumb hesitated, pulse hammering in her ears before she tapped play. Grainy footage flickered onto the screen, her own figure leaving the community hall 2 nights ago. The angle was low, shaky, like someone hiding behind a car. She watched herself walk down the sidewalk, unaware the glow of streetlights carving her silhouette. Then the camera zoomed closer. A voice whispered behind the lens, "She thinks no one sees her." Her stomach dropped. She nearly dropped the phone. The clip shifted. Now it was her in the grocery store, head down, neighbors whispering around her. The stalker's camera lingered on her face, her every step catalogued like prey. Another cut, the protest drizzle soaking her coat, her jaw set in defiance. She hadn't even known she was being watched. Her breath came sharp, shallow, each frame tightening the vice around her ribs. Then the third clip froze her blood. It was her apartment building. Her, unlocking her front door. The lens steady close enough to see the numbers on her doorframe, close enough to hear the soft creak of the hinges. And then as the door shut on screen, a whisper low and deliberate. Next time she won't see it coming. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the coffee table. The video replayed on a loop, the whisper crawling into every shadow of her apartment. Jasmine's eyes darted around the room. Corners seemed darker, the curtains thinner, the silence sharper. Every creak of the wood felt like a footstep behind her. Her chest heaved, caught between panic and rage. She locked the door again. checked the window latches twice, 3 times. Her reflection stared back from the glass, pale, terrified, but burning with fury. She picked up the phone again, her hands steadier now, her jaw clenched. The footage ran once more. She leaned close, glaring into the screen, whispering to the unseen watcher. "You want me afraid? Then you're going to see the one thing you can't erase. I don't disappear." Her voice was low, but it vibrated in the empty room like a vow. Still as the whisper replayed, next time she won't see it coming. A question clawed at her chest sharper than fear itself. Was she already too exposed to survive, or finally visible enough to matter? The memory of the stalker's video still clung to Jasmine like a second skin when she stepped into the open square that evening. But tonight the shadows did not own her. Hundreds had gathered, candles in hand, their flames flickering against the dark like fragile stars daring to rise. The air was heavy with silence at first, the kind that carried grief too sharp to name. But as Jasmine walked through the crowd, heads turned, whispers hushed, and a pulse of unity began to throb in the cold night air. She felt it in her bones, in the goose flesh rising along her arms, not fear this time, but the electricity of a people daring to breathe together. At the center of the square, a platform had been raised, nothing more than wooden boards on cinder blocks, but it felt like a stage cut from history. Jasmine climbed it slowly, her heels striking each step, with a hollow echo that carried across the gathering, like a drumbeat. The candlelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, her eyes glistening, her jaw set. She looked out and saw the faces, young, old, weary, determined, all staring back at her with the same question, would she still stand? For a moment her throat closed, tears swelling hot, but they weren't born of fear. They were born of resolve. She took the microphone, its cord snaking into the darkness, and the silence thickened until the night itself seemed to hold its breath. "We are here," she began, her voice low, trembling not with weakness, but with the gravity of what pressed inside her chest. "We are here because too many names have been buried, too many voices have been silenced, too many futures stolen before they ever began." Her voice cracked, and the sound cut raw across the square. But instead of breaking her, it bound the people tighter. She closed her eyes briefly, letting a tear streak down her cheek before lifting her chin again. The crowd shifted, a wave of murmurs rising, and Jasmine pressed on. "They told us to be quiet. They told us to stay small. But tonight, look around you. Do you see how many of us refuse?" Her arm rose, gesturing to the forest of candles, each flame trembling, but unyielding. The sight pierced her, the fragile glow gathering into a single force that made her chest ache with both sorrow and pride. A young girl in the front clutched her candle, close eyes wide with wonder, and Jasmine felt her knees weaken under the weight of responsibility, but she did not falter. The silence cracked. Then a single voice in the back calling out, "We are with you, Jasmine." Another followed, then another, until a chorus filled the air, low and steady at first, then swelling into a chant that vibrated through the ground. Jasmine's tears spilled freely now, her heart hammering in rhythm with their voices, and for the first time in weeks, the fear that had stalked her gave way to something stronger, belonging. She lowered the microphone slightly, letting their voices rise above hers, the sound washing over her like a tide. In the glow of hundreds of trembling flames, she stood tall, her figure carved in shadow and light, a woman no longer standing alone, but carried by the current of unity. Her breath came steady, her shoulders squared, and though her body trembled, it was not from terror, but from the raw power of hope breaking through. In that moment, Jasmine understood resolve was not forged in solitude, but in the fire of voices rising together, refusing to be silenced. The vigil's fire carried into the following days, and soon Jasmine's voice was no longer confined to a single square. She moved from city to city, each stop another wound, exposed another crowd gathering like storm clouds ready to break. At a rally in a school gymnasium, she stood beneath the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights, the walls lined with peeling banners, yet the room pulsed with life. She spoke of mothers holding folded flags, of fathers working double shifts, only to be cast aside, and as her voice trembled, the audience trembled with her. Faces lit with recognition, strangers gripping each other's hands, grief binding them tighter than chains ever could. The montage of moments unfolded like a reel of history in motion. In a church basement, she leaned against a wooden pulpit, her hand pressing the letter from her mother into the wood, as though anchoring herself to both her family and her cause. The air smelled of wax and dust, the pews creaking, as people leaned forward, drawn in by the weight of her words. "We carry scars not because we are weak," Jasmine declared, her eyes blazing beneath the dim light, "but because this country forced them upon us and we are still here." The crowd erupted not in chaos but in a wave of applause that rattled the walls, a sound fierce enough to shake the dust from the rafters. Another rally spilled into the open streets where she stood atop a makeshift stage of milk crates, the wind tugging at her coat as her voice cut through the hum of traffic. Children hoisted onto shoulders watched her with wide eyes, their innocence pressed against the rawness of her fight. Jasmine's gaze swept across the sea of faces, and in each one she saw fragments of her own fear, anger, exhaustion, but also a stubborn spark of hope. She raised her fist, not as a gesture of rage, but of survival, and the crowd mirrored it, hundreds of arms piercing the sky in a single defiant rhythm. The sound of chanting filled the avenue, not rehearsed, not orchestrated, but rising naturally, the roar of humanity claiming its voice. Her journey became a tapestry of shared pain and fragile triumph. In a union hall, she listened as an old steelworker spoke of broken promises, his voice cracking as tears carved tracks down his weathered cheeks. Jasmine placed a hand on his shoulder, her silence carrying more weight than any speech. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking to the people, she was speaking with them. Her grief folded into theirs until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The bond was raw, imperfect, but undeniable. Each rally added a new thread, weaving a movement too large to ignore. And though exhaustion gnawed at her, though the stalker's shadow still loomed, Jasmine carried herself with a steadiness that made crowds believe she could not be broken. Her body was fragile, her heart bruised, but her resolve burned brighter, with every face that looked up at her with desperate hope. The energy built like a tide, grief turning into empathy, empathy into unity, unity into the possibility of change. By the time Jasmine stepped down from another stage, her throat raw and her eyes swollen from tears, she no longer tried to hide the crowds, no longer saw a lone congresswoman, they saw themselves. And in their reflection, Jasmine found the strength to stand taller than she ever had before. The chants began like a heartbeat, steady and defiant, echoing down the wide avenue where Jasmine stood at the center of hundreds. Signs lifted high, candles still burned from the vigil, and the rhythm of footsteps rolled like thunder. Jasmine's throat was raw, but her voice carried above it all, slicing into the night. For a fleeting moment, hope felt unstoppable, electric binding strangers into one pulse. Then came the rupture. A sharp pop cracked through the chants. Another followed, and then the hiss of metal canisters hitting pavement. White gas exploded in violent plumes, swallowing the crowd in seconds. Screams erupted, coughing tore through the air. Signs crashed to the ground. Jasmine's lungs seized as the acrid sting burned her throat, but she didn't retreat. She yanked her sleeve across her mouth and pushed forward into the chaos, her heartbeat pounding louder than the sirens closing in. The march that had been a chorus of hope turned battlefield in an instant. Shadows thrashed in the smoke glass, shattered boots thundered. Jasmine stumbled, her eyes streaming, until her hand collided with another small trembling, clinging to her with desperate force. She blinked through the haze and saw a figure crumpled on the ground. It was Malik, the boy who once carried flyers through the neighborhood, the volunteer with a grin too big for his face. Now his lips were blue-tinged, his eyelids swollen shut from gas, his chest heaving in shallow bursts. Malik, Jasmine choked, dropping to her knees, dragging his weight onto her shoulder. The asphalt scraped her palms raw. Her blazer tore against the pavement, but none of it mattered. All she felt was the frail pulse thudding weakly against her arm. Figures surged around her, some running, some still raising fists defiantly into the choking fog. A protester tried to pull her toward safety, but Jasmine shook them off. "Help me get him out," she shouted, her voice strangled by gas. Together they staggered, Malik's body sagging between them through the blinding cloud. The world narrowed to flashes, riot shields advancing batons, slamming against the ground, the blinding glow of streetlights fractured by smoke. Jasmine's legs burned, her chest screamed for air, but she refused to collapse. She half-dragged, half-carried Malik through the chaos until the smog broke just enough for streetlights to cut through. They fell against a curb, Jasmine gasping, pressing trembling fingers to his neck. A pulse, faint but alive. Relief tore through her chest like lightning. Her eyes blurred with tears, not just from gas, but from fury. Fury that Malik, who believed enough to follow her into the storm, now lay broken in her arms. Fury that the cameras would never show this. Already she could imagine the headlines: Crockett's protest erupts in violence. They would show glass on the pavement, not Malik's body gasping for air. They would frame her as fire, never the hands shielding a boy from the blaze. She clutched his hand, anchoring herself to him, to the cause, to the fragile line between despair and defiance. The smoke still rolled behind her, blotting out the sky, swallowing voices into silence. Jasmine's silhouette against it was fragile and unyielding, all at once. A figure caught between being silenced and refusing to yield. Her lungs burned, her voice broke, but she whispered anyway, fierce and trembling, into the night. They will not erase him. They will not erase us. And yet, as the riot line closed in a question struck like a blade, would her fight save lives now, or only sacrifice more? The smoke from the protest had barely settled when the headlines struck like hammers. Crockett's protest erupts in violence. Congresswoman fans the flames of chaos. Screens replayed broken glass and tear gas, but the footage of Jasmine dragging Malik from the street was nowhere to be found. Now she sat beneath blistering studio lights, the cameras angled like rifles, the interviewer's smile sharp as a blade. Congresswoman, he began, voice smooth, lethal. Do you take responsibility for the injuries sustained during last night's march? Jasmine's throat tightened. She felt the burn of gas still lodged in her chest. Malik's limp weight still etched into her arms. Her voice trembled at first. We marched for dignity, not destruction. The interviewer leaned forward, eyes glittering, smelling blood. But isn't it true that your very presence incites unrest, that you pour fuel on flames already burning? People are hurt because of you. Do you even care? The words sliced like knives. For a heartbeat, Jasmine faltered. Malik's pale face flashed in her mind, the guilt pressing hard. The camera caught the flicker of pain across her face, and she knew the anchors would feast on it. But then her spine straightened. The tremor in her hands stilled. She leaned closer to the microphone, eyes locked on the lens with a fire that pierced through the glare. You want to talk about flames? Her voice rang steady, sharp. Those flames were lit long before I ever picked up a microphone. Lit by injustice, lit by silence, lit by a system that would rather choke a boy with gas than face the truth of why he was in the streets at all. The interviewer blinked, his grin faltering. Jasmine didn't stop. You call me fire, she snapped, her words cutting like glass. Then maybe you should ask who struck the match. The studio went dead quiet. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights flickering like stunned eyes. Jasmine's chest rose heavy, but her gaze never broke, her words hanging in the air like smoke no one could clear. Outside, the networks would spin. They would loop her stammer, not her steel. They would slice her truth into weaponized fragments. But in that studio, in that moment, Jasmine had burned through their script. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and despair, every fluorescent light humming too loudly as Jasmine pushed through the swinging doors. Her chest tightened with each step, the memory of smoke and screaming still fresh in her ears. When she reached the room, her breath caught on the bed lay Malik, the young volunteer she had mentored, the boy who once carried flyers through the neighborhood with a smile too big for his face. Now his skin was pale, his body tangled in tubes and wires, his chest rising shallow against the weight of machines. Jasmine froze in the doorway, guilt striking harder than any headline ever could. She remembered his eagerness, the way he had told her, "You made me believe we could change this place." Her throat closed and she pressed a trembling hand against the doorframe, as though bracing herself against a storm. Malik's mother sat by his side, eyes hollow, fingers clutching his limp hand, her gaze lifting to Jasmine with a mixture of grief and accusation that pierced straight through her armor. She stepped closer, her heels clicking like guilty echoes on the tile, each sound too sharp in the suffocating silence. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for Malik's hand, her fingers wrapping around his but finding no strength in the grasp. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I should have protected you." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room, grief pulling at her ribs until she could barely breathe. The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to her anguish, the sterile room swallowing every fragment of her regret. Jasmine bowed her head, her tears falling onto the bedsheet, her body trembling with the unbearable truth that her fight had brought him here. Yet even as guilt carved deep into her, she felt the faintest spark of resolve, the knowledge that Malik had stood beside her, not because he was forced, but because he believed. And now she would carry that belief for him, no matter the cost. The fluorescent lights above the hospital bed flickered, washing the room in a pale, merciless glow. Jasmine stood frozen, one hand clamped to the cold steel of the bed rail, her chest heaving as grief pressed against her ribs. The young protester, barely clinging to life, was more than a casualty of chaos. He was someone she had once guided, mentored, believed in. His lips trembled, the oxygen mask fogging with each fragile breath. Jasmine leaned closer, her tears slipping silently onto the sheets, every drop a confession of guilt she could not speak aloud. Her voice cracked as she whispered apologies, words she feared he might never hear. But then through the blur of pain, his eyes fluttered open, fixing on her with startling clarity. "You can't stop. Not now." The words emerged like a spark breaking through ash, frail yet burning with urgency. Jasmine's knees weakened, her grip on the rail tightening as if it alone kept her standing. The hospital monitors beeped, a steady reminder of how close the line between silence and eternity really was. Relief and agony crashed together inside her. The weight of guilt shifted, not erased but transformed into something sharper, more demanding. She pressed her forehead to the bed rail, tears soaking into her clenched fists, and for the first time since the unrest erupted, she felt a flicker of direction. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a mandate carved in grief. The room seemed to close, and the sounds of distant hospital chaos fading until only his faint breath tethered her to the moment. Jasmine straightened slowly, her eyes burning, her pulse echoing the unspoken vow now sealed in her heart. She would not retreat. She could not. But the question hung in the sterile air, unresolved, dangerous. Can grief truly be the engine for justice, or will it consume her before the fight is won? The hospital's sterile silence still clung to Jasmine when she sat at her desk that night, the glow of her laptop screen cutting through the dark. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling, not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of what she carried. The images of the fallen protester, the mentor she had guided, bled into her memory with every blink. Jasmine closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and began to type. Her words did not come as policy or speeches, but as a wound laid bare. She wrote of injustice not in numbers, but in names: the young mother left without care, the veteran silenced at the ballot box, the boy whose hospital bed had become a battlefield. Each line was sharpened by outrage, yet softened with compassion. Every story she pulled into her letter became both confession and call to arms, grief crystallized into resolve. The letter spread like fire the moment it went live. Screens lit up across the country, faces leaned closer, and strangers whispered, "She's telling our story." Hashtags surged, news anchors quoted lines verbatim, and in kitchens and union halls, her words became chants. Jasmine's letter was not polished, it was raw, it was jagged, but that rawness was exactly what made it unshakable. As dawn broke, Jasmine watched the rising tide of comments, survivors thanking her parents, sending photos of children wearing armbands, students vowing to march. The backlash that once cornered her now drowned beneath a flood of solidarity. For the first time since the chaos began, Jasmine felt something beyond grief clawing its way up inside her purpose. And in that purpose, outrage burned steady, not wild. Her letter had not just gone viral, it had redefined the fight. What the streets shouted, what the hospital whispered, what her heart feared, all now lived on a single screen, projected into millions of homes. And as Jasmine leaned back in her chair, exhausted but unbroken, she realized this was not an ending. It was a rebirth. The chamber was packed, the air thick with anticipation, as Jasmine stepped to the front of the commission table. Cameras hovered like vultures, their lenses capturing every tremor in the room. For a moment, silence pressed down, the kind that could shatter under a single word. Jasmine adjusted the microphone, her voice steady, but charged with an undercurrent of fire. This commission was never meant to be a performance, she declared, eyes sweeping the crowd. It was meant to be a reckoning. Heads lifted, jaws tightened, the gravity of her words sinking deep. One by one, testimonies began. A mother recounted how her son had been stopped and beaten, her voice breaking on every syllable. A veteran spoke of betrayal, how the very country he fought for had turned its back on him. Their pain ricocheted through the hall, igniting murmurs of outrage and fists clenched against polished wood. Jasmine leaned forward, listening, as if each word were carved into her skin. She scribbled notes furiously, her pen moving like a blade, striking truth into paper. The stories piled up raw and unfiltered, until the air itself seemed to pulse with fury and resolve. A man in the back stood abruptly, shouting through tears about his brother, who never made it home. Security tensed, but Jasmine raised her hand, stopping them cold. "Let him speak," she insisted, her voice slicing through chaos. The man's trembling confession bled into the record, no longer invisible, no longer denied. By the time the testimonies ended, the room was no longer fractured, voices but a chorus. Hope surged alongside anger, a strange and powerful fusion that refused to be contained. Jasmine closed her notebook slowly, her face pale but unwavering, as if she'd absorbed the weight of every wound. When she finally rose, the audience followed a tidal wave of solidarity cresting behind her. Chants erupted, echoing beyond the walls, spilling into streets where more had gathered to listen through speakers. Jasmine did not smile, but her eyes burned, because this wasn't victory yet. It was only the storm gathering strength. The question lingered like thunder: would the system bend under this pressure or break? The commission hall had barely emptied when Jasmine's phone vibrated with a message that didn't belong to her world of community cries and open letters. A name appeared on the screen, one she had only seen carved onto brass plaques and whispered in political backrooms. The invitation was clear, but heavy: meet privately, away from cameras, away from witnesses, away from the voices that had carried her this far. Jasmine stared at the message, the weight of it pressing harder than any insult thrown at her in public hearings. Backroom conditions: no live streams, no paper trail, no guarantees. Her pulse raced with both suspicion and an ache she didn't want to admit. Was this finally proof that her movement had pierced the walls of power, or just another trap dressed as opportunity? She sat back in her chair, replaying the sound of testimonies from earlier that day. Mothers trembling as they spoke of empty dinner tables. Veterans gripping their medals as if they were shields against shame. Each story had built the fire that made the commission impossible to ignore. And now suddenly that fire was being asked to shrink into the quiet shadows of a closed-door conversation. The offer carried temptation, influence, funding, maybe even legislation. But Jasmine's gut recoiled at the thought of silencing the very people who had handed her their trust. If she stepped into that room, she might walk out with progress or with her integrity burned to ashes. And still, the possibility of cracking the fortress from the inside whispered to her like a dangerous siren. She gripped the edge of the desk, eyes burning with exhaustion and resolve. The question she couldn't shake clawed at her ribs: was this compromise or co-option? The silence of the empty hall seemed to echo back at her, forcing her to confront the dilemma alone. Should Jasmine walk into the lion's den or roar from outside? The night bled into a restless dawn, and Jasmine stood before a camera that streamed to thousands, soon millions. The screen around her lit with cascading messages, stories pouring in from strangers who were no longer faceless mothers clutching wristbands from lost children, veterans betrayed by false promises, workers dismissed for daring to speak. The crowd beyond the lens erupted in waves of applause, their chants merging with the comments scrolling in real time. It was no longer a meeting or a commission, it was a movement. Jasmine steadied her breath, the weight of so many voices pressing against her chest. Each testimony she had carried, each folder of evidence she had unsealed, became more than documents. They were torches passed hand to hand, now blazing across the public square. "You've been told to stay quiet," Jasmine declared, her voice slicing through static. But silence was never safety, it was surrender. The words cracked like thunder, and the crowd's roar swelled in reply. For the first time, the sound was not anger alone, but hope raw, undeniable electric. Her eyes softened as the cheers rippled the hard edge of fire, shifting into something luminous. She leaned toward the lens as if whispering across miles, "You are not powerless. You are not forgotten." The quiet in her tone drew the crowd into stillness, like a tide pulling back before a storm. She spoke of the child whose last breath had been turned into a corporate slogan of the family forced to choose between rent and medication, of the unseen hands that carried others when the system turned away. In that moment, her pain became their map, and their map her strength. The glow of the studio lights caught her features, but it was not the lights that made her shine. It was the relief etched into her face, the empathy threaded into each syllable, the passion that refused to dim even under exhaustion. "If you want change," she continued, "you don't wait for permission. You build it together." The feed filled with pledges, people organizing vigils, offering shelter, demanding audits, vowing to march. For the first time, Jasmine was not asking for allies, she had them. She outlined steps like lifelines: demand hearings, record abuses, uplift survivors instead of silencing them. She called not for vengeance, but for vigilance, urging the crowd to see themselves as keepers of each other's dignity. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "I cannot promise safety, but I can promise you will never stand alone." Tears broke across the crowd like a contagion, spilling into the very comments box as strangers comforted strangers. What was once one woman's burden had become a nation's vow. Hours later, when the chant still carried through streets and the feed finally dimmed, Jasmine walked home under the weight of dusk. The city's hum was softer now, punctuated by distant echoes of unity chants rising from blocks away, candles flickering in windows. She pressed her coat tighter against the night, her steps slow, not from defeat, but from something heavier, the knowledge that victory was never permanent, only rented, always fragile. Her thoughts unraveled in the rhythm of her footsteps. Power, she realized, had never been the destination. It was the decoy. Our worth isn't with power. Jasmine thought, her eyes scanning the horizon of apartment lights, but with each other. The truth was not in the marble chambers or sealed contracts, it was in the voices that refused to vanish. And now those voices had found one another. She stopped at a corner where chants drifted faintly, barely audible, but steady like a heartbeat. For a moment, Jasmine closed her eyes and let the sound carry her, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as one among many. When she opened them again, the question rose, unbidden, heavier than any speech she had given. What will you do now that you see you're not alone? The story of Jasmine is not just about one woman standing against injustice. It is about the timeless truth that dignity and courage do not belong only to the young or the powerful. No matter your age, your voice, your presence, and your choices still hold the power to bend the course of history. Jasmine's refusal to shrink in the face of humiliation reminds us that silence often serves the oppressor, while even a single word or a quiet act of defiance can awaken a community. For those over 50, this message carries a deeper weight. You have lived through decades of change, struggle, and resilience. Your wisdom is not just memory, it is guidance for the generations watching today. Jasmine's journey shows that every stage of life is a chance to stand taller, to mentor, to inspire, and to prove that courage never grows old. What role will you play now, knowing that your experience is the very tool others need? Will you step forward calm, steady, and unafraid to ensure that justice and dignity remain alive for those who come after you? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.